The iron chains rattled like bones in a grave as Marshal Garrett raised his hand for silence. The sound cut through the hot Texas afternoon like a knife through butter, and Helen Louise Parker knew in that moment her life would never be the same. She stood on that makeshift platform in the center of Fort Defiance, with her 7-year-old son, Peter, pressed against her skirts, his small fingers clutching the faded calico fabric as if it were the only solid thing left in a world that had turned to quicksand beneath their feet. It was August of 1867, 2 years after the war had ended, but the scars remained fresh across the Texas frontier. The wounds were carved into the land and the people who struggled to survive on it, and the crowd that gathered in the dusty town square numbered close to 60 souls. They were a mix of ranchers and drifters, shopkeepers and soldiers from the nearby garrison. Their faces a study in discomfort and morbid curiosity as they formed a loose semicircle around the platform where Helen stood with her son, waiting to be sold like livestock to the highest bidder. The sun beat down merciless and bright, turning the wooden platform into a griddle that burned through the thin soles of Helen's worn boots. She could feel sweat trickling down her spine beneath the rough homespun dress that had once been blue, but had faded to the color of old bruises after 6 months of captivity. 6 months of sleeping on hard ground and eating whatever scraps her Kiowa captors had thrown her way. 6 months of wondering if she would ever see civilization again, or if she and Peter would simply disappear into the vast emptiness of the Llano Estacado like so many others before them. But she had survived, and more importantly, Peter had survived. Though the boy was quieter now than he had been before the raid, his eyes held shadows no 7-year-old should carry, and Helen kept her hand on his shoulder as Marshal Garrett cleared his throat and began his grim recitation of the facts that would determine their fate. "Lot 17, Garrett announced, his voice carrying across the square with the practiced authority of a man who had done this before. The distaste in his tone suggested he took no pleasure in it. White woman, approximately 28 years of age, recovered from Kiowa raiding party 3 days ago, along with one male child, age 7. Both in fair health considering the circumstances, no visible signs of disease or permanent injury. Woman has some education and can read and write, useful for household management or teaching. Boy is able-bodied and can perform light labor." Helen felt Peter flinch at the word labor, and she squeezed his shoulder gently, a silent message that they would endure this together, the same way they had endured everything else. The raid on their homestead that had killed her husband James, the long, terrible march into Comanche territory, the nights of fear and hunger and uncertainty. They had survived all of that, and they would survive this too somehow. "Bidding starts at $100 for the pair," Garrett continued, and Helen heard the sharp intake of breath from several people in the crowd. $100 was more than most men made in 3 months of hard labor, an astronomical sum for a widow and child with nothing to their names but the clothes on their backs and the trauma etched into their bones. Silence stretched across the square like a taut wire, broken only by the hot wind that stirred up dust devils and sent them skittering between the buildings. Helen kept her eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the crowd, refusing to meet the gazes of the men who were evaluating her worth in dollars and cents. They were reducing her humanity to a transaction as cold and impersonal as buying a plow or a mule. She recognized some faces in the crowd, people who had known her before, when she and James had been building their small ranch 15 miles outside of town, back when Peter had been just a baby and the future had seemed full of promise instead of ashes. Mrs. Crane from the general store stood near the back, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, and old Dutch Keller, who had helped James raise the barn frame, was there too. His weathered face was tight with something that might have been shame or anger or both. But there were other faces too, strangers who had drifted into Fort Defiance in the chaos of Reconstruction. Men with hard eyes and harder intentions, and Helen felt her stomach clench as she saw how some of them were looking at her. Not with pity, but with calculation. The kind of looks that made her skin crawl and her arms instinctively tighten around Peter. $100, Garrett repeated, scanning the crowd. Do I hear 100? A man near the front shifted his weight. A rancher named Silas Worth, who owned 10,000 acres north of town and had a reputation for working his hands until they dropped. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but then closed it again, his eyes sliding away from Helen's face. She felt a strange mix of relief and despair. Relief that this particular man would not own her. Despair that perhaps no one would bid at all, and she and Peter would be turned over to the territorial authority to be parceled out as indentured labor, which was often worse than outright slavery. 75. A voice called from the left side of the crowd, and Helen's blood turned to ice water. She knew that voice. Cyrus Blackwood. The crowd parted slightly to let Blackwood move forward, and Helen felt her knees go weak. Cyrus Blackwood was the wealthiest man in 3 counties, owner of the Broken Crown Ranch that sprawled across 40,000 acres of prime grazing land. He was 45 years old, widowed twice under circumstances that prompted whispered speculation, and his reputation for cruelty to both animals and people was well established. He had offered to buy James's land before the raid, had made an insultingly low offer, and then threatened consequences when James refused. Helen had always suspected that Blackwood had somehow tipped off the Kiowa raiders about the homestead's location, though she had no proof, only a gnawing certainty in her gut. Blackwood was dressed in a fine black suit despite the heat, his silver watch chain glinting in the sun, and his pale blue eyes were fixed on Helen with an expression that made her want to scrub her skin raw. He smiled, showing teeth that were too white, too perfect, like a wolf's grin before it strikes. $75 for the woman and the boy, Blackwood repeated, his voice smooth as oiled leather. And I'll throw in an additional 25 to cover the marshal's trouble in retrieving them from the savages. Garrett's jaw tightened, but he nodded. $75. Do I hear 80? Silence again, heavier this time, suffocating. The crowd wouldn't meet Helen's eyes now. They all knew what it meant if Blackwood bought her, what her life would become, but no one had the money or the courage to challenge him. Fear was as effective as any chain. Peter began to tremble against Helen's side, and she bent down, whispering fiercely in his ear. Be brave, my love. Be brave like your father. Going once, Garrett said. And Helen heard the reluctance in his voice. The man was doing his job, but he wasn't happy about it. Going twice, Garrett continued, and Helen closed her eyes, praying to a god she wasn't sure was listening anymore. Praying for a miracle, even though miracles seemed to be in short supply on the Texas frontier. Then she heard it, hoofbeats, fast and getting closer. The crowd turned as one, murmuring in confusion and alarm, and Helen opened her eyes to see a rider approaching from the east at a full gallop. The horse was a paint stallion, black and white in bold patches, and it moved with the fluid grace of an animal bred for war. The rider sat the horse like he was part of it, moving in perfect synchronization, and as he drew closer, Helen could make out details that sent a fresh wave of fear and something else, something stranger through her chest. The rider was Comanche. There was no mistaking the way he sat his horse, the cut of his buckskin clothing, the long black hair that flew behind him like a war banner. But it was more than that. It was the red paint that streaked his chest and arms, the traditional markings of a warrior who had counted coup in battle, who had earned the right to ride as one of the elite. The people called men like this blood riders, warriors whose reputation preceded them like thunder before a storm. The rider pulled his horse to a dramatic stop at the edge of the crowd, which scattered back like startled quail. The paint stallion reared once, hooves pawing the air, and the rider controlled it with barely a shift of his weight. He was tall for a Comanche, probably close to 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a face that could have been carved from granite. His eyes were dark as obsidian and just as sharp, And when they fixed on Helen, she felt like he could see straight through to her bones. "I will take them both," the Comanche said, his English clear and unaccented, which surprised everyone, including Helen. His voice was deep, resonant, carrying across the square with absolute authority. The crowd erupted in chaos. Men shouted, women gasped, and Marshal Garrett's hand dropped to the pistol at his hip, though he didn't draw it. Cyrus Blackwood's face went purple with rage. "This is outrageous," Blackwood sputtered. "You can't seriously be considering selling white captives to a savage." The Comanche's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, something cold and dangerous. "I am Silent Hunter of the Mythical Comanche. I speak English because I was educated at the Quaker Mission School in Indian Territory. I have money because I scout for the U.S. Army. I am here because I choose to be, not because anyone permits it." He dismounted in one fluid motion and walked toward the platform. And Helen noticed that he moved with a slight limp, favoring his left leg. An old injury, probably from battle. The crowd parted before him, not out of respect but out of fear. And Blackwood actually took a step back despite himself. Silent Hunter stopped at the base of the platform and looked up at Helen and Peter. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were not unkind. "I offer $200, gold coin." "For both," the crowd gasped. $200 was double Blackwood's offer, more money than most people in Fort Defiance would see in a year. Marshal Garrett looked stunned. "Now see here," Blackwood began, his voice shaking with fury. "I had the standing bid, and now you are outbid," Silent Hunter said calmly. He reached into a leather pouch at his waist and produced a handful of gold coins, letting them catch the sunlight. 200 U.S. gold, paid in full right now. Garrett looked between Blackwood and Silent Hunter, clearly wrestling with the situation. Legally, the highest bidder should win, but selling white captives to an Indian, even one who scouted for the army, was going to cause problems. Political problems, social problems, the kind of problems that could cost a marshal his job. "Marshal," Silent Hunter said, and his voice was quieter now, but no less intense. "I know the law. The highest bid wins unless the bidder is disqualified by inability to pay or by criminal record. I can pay, and my record is clean. In fact, I have a letter of commendation from Colonel Mackenzie at Fort Richardson." He produced a folded paper from inside his shirt and handed it up to Garrett. The marshal unfolded it, read it, and his eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. Whatever that letter said, it clearly carried weight. Blackwood could see the situation slipping away from him. 225, he said through gritted teeth. "Final offer." Silent Hunter didn't hesitate. 300! The crowd exploded in shocked whispers. $300 was an unthinkable sum. Blackwood's face went from purple to white, his hands clenching into fists. He was rich, but $300 in gold was serious money even for him. And everyone could see him calculating whether his desire for revenge against James Parker's widow was worth that much. 350! Blackwood snarled, and now it wasn't about Helen anymore. It was about pride and power and not losing face in front of the entire town. 500, Silent Hunter said, and his voice was like iron. Gold, paid now. Final bid. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. $500 was a fortune, the kind of money that could buy a small ranch with livestock and equipment. It was madness. It was impossible. And yet Silent Hunter stood there calm as still water, his hand resting on the leather pouch that presumably held enough gold to back up his claim. Cyrus Blackwood stared at the Comanche warrior with pure hatred burning in his eyes. But even he couldn't match that bid without bankrupting himself. He had been beaten and everyone knew it. The humiliation was total. Going once, Garrett said, his voice barely above a whisper. Going twice. He paused, giving Blackwood one last chance, but the rancher just turned on his heel and shoved his way through the crowd, his face twisted with rage. Sold, Garrett said finally. To Silent Hunter for $500. Silent Hunter climbed onto the platform in 2 strides and counted out the gold coins into Garrett's shaking hands. 50 coins. each worth $10, glinting in the afternoon sun like pieces of a dream. Then he turned to Helen, and for the first time since the raid began 6 months ago, she looked into the eyes of someone who might not mean her harm. "Can you ride?" he asked simply. Helen nodded, not trusting her voice. "Then we leave now. Before anyone changes their mind or decides to make trouble." He looked down at Peter. "Can you sit a horse, boy?" Peter nodded, his eyes huge in his pale face. But when Silent Hunter reached for him, the boy didn't pull away. Something in the warrior's manner, some fundamental honesty or strength, made the child trust him despite everything he had been taught about Indians. Silent Hunter lifted Peter onto the paint stallion with surprising gentleness, then helped Helen up behind the boy. He swung up behind them both, and Helen found herself pressed against the broad chest of a Comanche warrior, feeling the heat of his skin through the buckskin shirt. Smelling sage and leather and wood smoke. "Hold on," Silent Hunter said quietly. "We ride hard." And then they were moving, the paint stallion surging forward with power that Helen could feel in every muscle. The crowd scattered before them, and Silent Hunter guided the horse through the confusion with expert skill. Behind them, Helen heard Cyrus Blackwood shouting something, heard the rage and the promises of retribution. But the words were already fading as Fort Defiance fell away behind them, and the open prairies stretched ahead, vast and golden under the afternoon sun. Peter was crying silently, his small body shaking with emotion, and Helen wrapped her arms around him from behind, holding him close while Silent Hunter's arms encircled them both, keeping them steady on the galloping horse. They rode like that for what felt like hours, putting distance between themselves and the town, between themselves and Cyrus Blackwood's fury, between themselves and a fate that Helen couldn't bear to imagine. Finally, when the sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon and the land had transformed into rolling hills, dotted with mesquite and juniper, Silent Hunter slowed the paint to a walk. The horse was lathered with sweat but still strong, its breathing deep but steady, and Silent Hunter patted its neck with obvious affection. "We stop here tonight," he said. "Make camp. Tomorrow we ride to my land." Helen finally found her voice. "Why?" she asked, the word coming out hoarse and rough. "Why did you do this?" Silent Hunter was quiet for a long moment, guiding the horse toward a small grove of cottonwoods where a creek ran clear over smooth stones. "Because some things are wrong," he said finally, "and when you can stop them, you should." It wasn't a complete answer. Helen knew that instinctively, knew there were layers to this man's decision that she didn't yet understand. But for now, as he helped her and Peter down from the horse and began efficiently setting up a camp with practiced movements, she decided it was answer enough. They had been saved from Cyrus Blackwood. They had been given a chance at something, though she didn't yet know what. And the man who had saved them was a mystery wrapped in red war paint and gold coins, a Comanche warrior who spoke perfect English and carried letters of commendation from army colonels, a man who had just spent a fortune to buy the freedom of 2 strangers. Helen watched Silent Hunter work, watched the way he moved with economy and grace despite his limp, watched the way he spoke softly to his horse and to Peter, his voice gentle in a way that contradicted everything she thought she knew about Comanche warriors. And she wondered what the next chapter of her life would bring, what bargain she had just entered into, what price would eventually be demanded for this rescue that seemed too good to be true. But as the sun set and Silent Hunter built a fire and shared dried meat and water from his canteen, as Peter finally stopped crying and even managed a small smile when the warrior showed him how to whistle through a blade of grass, Helen felt something she hadn't felt in 6 long months. Not quite hope, not yet, but maybe the distant possibility of it. Like the first star appearing in a darkening sky, the morning came with a chill that surprised Helen. A reminder that even in Texas, the nights could turn cold when summer began its slow surrender to autumn. She woke to find Peter still asleep beside her, wrapped in a thick buffalo robe that Silent Hunter must have placed over them during the night. The Comanche warrior himself was already awake, crouched by the remnants of their fire and coaxing it back to life with small sticks and prairie grass. He moved with the kind of quiet efficiency that spoke of years spent in the wilderness, and Helen watched him for a moment before sitting up. Careful not to wake her son, Silent Hunter glanced at her, his dark eyes unreadable in the grey pre-dawn light. "There is coffee," he said, gesturing to a battered tin pot that sat near the flames. "And cornbread from yesterday. We eat, then ride. My land is still 2 days away." Helen accepted the cup he poured for her, the metal hot against her palms, and she wrapped her fingers around it gratefully. The coffee was strong and bitter, nothing like the chicory blend she used to make in her own kitchen back when she had a kitchen, back when life made sense. She sipped it slowly, letting the heat spread through her chest, and studied the man who had purchased her freedom for a king's ransom. In the morning light, Silent Hunter looked different than he had in the chaos of Fort Defiance. The red war paint was gone, washed away in the creek, and without it his face seemed younger, less fierce. There were scars, certainly, a thin white line across his left cheekbone, another that disappeared into his hairline above his right temple. His hands were scarred, too, the backs of his knuckles marked with old wounds that had healed into raised tissue. These were the hands of a warrior, but also the hands of someone who had survived things that should have killed him. "You have questions," Silent Hunter said, not looking at her as he turned the cornbread in the pan. It was a statement, not a question. "Many," Helen admitted, "starting with why you spent $500 on 2 people you don't know." Silent Hunter was quiet for a long moment, his attention seemingly focused on the food. But Helen could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened slightly. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured. 7 years ago I had a wife. Her name was Bright Morning. She was Penateka like me, and we had been promised to each other since we were children. When we married, I thought I knew what happiness was." He paused, using a stick to push the cornbread around in the pan. "We had 1 year together. 1 year of building our life, of planning for children, of learning each other's rhythms. Then the Texas Rangers came." Helen felt her breath catch. She knew what was coming, had heard enough stories about ranger raids on Comanche camps, about the brutal efficiency with which they operated, about the bodies left behind. "They attacked at dawn," Silent Hunter continued, his voice carefully controlled, stripped of emotion in a way that made it somehow more terrible. "I was hunting 2 miles from camp. By the time I heard the gunfire and rode back, it was over. Bright Morning was dead, shot while trying to run. She was carrying our unborn child." He finally looked up at Helen, and she saw something in his eyes that made her chest ache. "The Rangers took captives that day, women and children, sold them at auction in San Antonio. I tried to buy them back, but I was just a warrior then. I had nothing but my horse and my weapons. I watched them sold to men who looked at them the way that Rancher looked at you." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant call of a meadowlark. Peter stirred in his sleep but didn't wake, and Helen was grateful. This was not a story for a child's ears. "I am sorry," Helen said finally, knowing the words were inadequate but having nothing better to offer. "I am so sorry." Silent Hunter shook his head. "After Bright Morning died, I left my people for a time. I was angry, wanted revenge against all Texans, all white men, but the elders counseled patience, said that more killing would only bring more death. I didn't listen well." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I raided alone, struck at ranches and supply wagons, took horses and weapons. I thought I was honoring Bright Morning's memory. I was just drowning in grief." He served the cornbread onto 2 tin plates and handed one to Helen. She took it automatically, her appetite gone, but her hands needing something to do. "What changed?" she asked. "I got careless. Took an arrow in the leg during a fight with Kiowa raiders who thought I was encroaching on their territory." Silent Hunter touched his left thigh, where Helen had noticed the limp. "The wound went bad. Fever set in. I would have died, but a Quaker missionary named Thomas Wright found me. He was traveling with a military escort, bringing supplies to a reservation. He convinced the soldiers not to shoot me, convinced them I was worth saving." He ate a piece of cornbread, chewing slowly. "Thomas nursed me back to health. Took 3 months, During that time, he taught me English, taught me to read and write, taught me about his God and his beliefs. He never tried to make me abandon my own ways, just offered his as an addition, not a replacement. Helen found herself drawn into the story, despite her confusion about why he was sharing it. "He sounds like a good man, the best I have known," Silent Hunter agreed. "When I was healed, Thomas asked what I would do with my life. Would I return to raiding, to the path of anger and death? Or would I choose something different? He said that Bright Morning would not want me to destroy myself in her name. He was right, though it took me time to accept it." He poured himself more coffee. "I began scouting for the army. Thomas arranged it through his contacts. I used my knowledge of the land, of Comanche tactics, to help prevent conflicts rather than start them. I tracked raiders, both Comanche and white, helped return stolen livestock, helped negotiate safe passage for travelers. The army paid well, and I saved everything for 7 years, Helen said, understanding beginning to dawn. "You saved for 7 years, waiting for a chance to do what I could not do for Bright Morning's people." Silent Hunter met her eyes. "When I heard about the auction in Fort Defiance, heard that white captives were being sold, I knew this was the chance. I could not save my wife, could not save our child, could not save the women taken that day 7 years ago. But I could save you, I could save your son, and by doing so, maybe I could begin to balance the scales, to honor Bright Morning's memory in a way that creates life instead of taking it." Helen felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she blinked them back. "That is a heavy burden to place on 2 strangers. I do not expect you to carry my burden," Silent Hunter said quietly. "I expect you to live, to build a life for yourself and your son. That is all. That is enough." He stood, moving to check on his horse. "We should wake the boy. We have many miles to cover today." Peter woke slowly, confused and disoriented, until he remembered where they were. He clung to Helen for a moment, and she held him close, breathing in the smell of his hair, grateful beyond words that they were together, that they had survived. Silent Hunter gave them space, busying himself with breaking camp, and Helen appreciated the quiet respect he showed for their need to orient themselves to this strange new reality. They ate quickly, and then Silent Hunter helped them onto his horse. The paint stallion, whose name Helen learned was Stormwalker, accepted their weight with patient strength. Silent Hunter swung up behind them, and they began to ride, heading west toward land that Helen had never seen, toward a future she could not imagine. The landscape changed as they traveled, becoming more rugged and wild. They crossed creeks swollen with late summer rain, navigated through stands of oak and juniper, climbed hills that revealed vistas of endless rolling prairie. Silent Hunter maintained a steady pace, not pushing Stormwalker too hard, but keeping them moving with purpose. He was clearly familiar with this country, taking routes that avoided open ground where they might be spotted, seeking natural cover and water sources with the instinct of someone who had traveled these paths many times before. During the ride, Peter began to come out of his shell. The boy was naturally curious, and being on horseback, seeing new country, seemed to awaken something in him that had been dormant during the months of captivity. He asked Silent Hunter questions about the plants they passed, about the tracks they saw in the soft earth near creek crossings, about the birds that wheeled overhead. Silent Hunter answered each question with surprising patience, his voice taking on a teaching quality that reminded Helen of how her own father had spoken to her when she was a child, explaining the world with care and attention. "That track belongs to a coyote," he would say, or "those are turkey vultures. They ride the thermal currents without flapping their wings. Very efficient. Or that plant with the yellow flowers is snakeweed. Useful for treating wounds, but poisonous if you eat too much." Helen listened to these exchanges and felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. Peter was responding to Silent Hunter in a way he hadn't responded to anyone since his father died. And she realized with a pang that her son needed this, needed a man who could teach him and guide him, needed to rebuild trust in adults after months of trauma. They stopped at midday to rest the horse and eat dried meat and pemmican that Silent Hunter produced from his saddlebags. They sat in the shade of a massive oak tree, its branches spreading wide overhead, and for the first time since the auction, Helen felt something almost like peace. The terror of the previous day was fading into memory, replaced by the simple rhythm of travel, of moving through space with purpose. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Tell me about your husband, Silent Hunter said during the rest. It was not quite a question, more an invitation, and Helen found herself wanting to talk about James, wanting to honor his memory by speaking his name aloud. James was a dreamer, she began, smiling at the memory. He wanted to build something lasting, a ranch that could support a family for generations. He had plans for everything, sketches of buildings we would construct, lists of livestock we would raise, ideas for crops that might grow in this difficult soil. She paused, the smile fading. He worked himself nearly to death, trying to make it all happen. We had been on that land for 3 years when the raid came. 3 years of backbreaking labor, of small victories and constant setbacks. And then one morning the Kiowa came, and it was all gone in minutes. Silent Hunter nodded slowly. The frontier takes everything if you let it. The trick is deciding what you will not let it take. And what won't you let it take? Helen asked. He considered the question, his dark eyes distant. My humanity, he said finally. The frontier wants to make us all into beasts, into creatures driven only by survival and revenge. I will not become that. I will not let grief and anger turn me into something bright morning would not recognize. They rode through the afternoon, the sun arcing across the sky and beginning its descent toward the horizon. The temperature dropped slightly, and a breeze picked up, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Stormwalkers' hooves drummed a steady rhythm against the hard-packed earth, and Helen found herself almost dozing, lulled by the motion and the warmth of Silent Hunter's presence behind her. As evening approached, they crested a rise, and Silent Hunter pulled the horse to a stop. There, he said, pointing toward the valley below. That is my land. Helen looked where he indicated and felt her breath catch. The valley was beautiful, green and lush, with a river running through its center. She could see structures in the distance, buildings that suggested a well-established ranch or settlement. Trees dotted the landscape, and she could make out what looked like corrals and fields. How much land do you have? She asked. Surprised by the scale of what she was seeing, 2 sections, Silent Hunter replied. 1,280 acres. I bought it 4 years ago with money I had saved from scouting. The government was selling parcels to anyone with cash, trying to encourage settlement. They did not care that I was Comanche, only that my money was good. There was a note of irony in his voice. I built the house myself, with help from Thomas Wright and some of his Quaker friends. The barn and corrals came later. I've been raising horses, training them for the army, and for ranchers who value quality animals. Peter's eyes were wide. You have a whole ranch? Yes, Silent Hunter said simply. And now you will live on it. Both of you. They descended into the valley as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. As they drew closer, Helen could make out more details. The house was substantial, built of stone and timber with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. It looked solid, permanent, like it had been there for much longer than 4 years. The barn was equally impressive, a large structure with good lines and what appeared to be a sound roof. But what struck Helen most was the sense of order and care that pervaded the property. The fences were well maintained, the corrals properly constructed, the whole place radiating a feeling of someone who took pride in their work. This was not the camp of a nomadic warrior. This was a home. As they approached the house, a figure emerged from the barn. An older man, white-haired and bent with age, wearing the plain grey clothing of a Quaker. His face lit up when he saw Silent Hunter, and he hurried forward with more speed than his years should have allowed. John, the old man called, using a name Helen had not heard before. You are back, and you have brought guests. Silent Hunter dismounted and helped Helen and Peter down. Thomas, he said warmly, embracing the older man. Yes, I went to Fort Defiance. "This is Mrs. Helen Parker and her son Peter. They will be staying with us." Thomas Wright looked at Helen with kind eyes that seemed to see more than she wanted to reveal. "You are welcome here, Mrs. Parker," he said gently. "Any friend of John's is a friend of mine, though I suspect the story of how you came to be here is more complicated than that simple statement would suggest." "John?" Helen repeated, looking at Silent Hunter with confusion. The warrior smiled slightly, the first real smile she had seen from him. "Thomas could not pronounce my Comanche name when we first met, and I needed an English name for dealing with the army and with land agents. Thomas suggested John after a prophet in his holy book. I accepted it. I am Silent Hunter to my people, John to the white world, and both names are true." Thomas led them into the house, and Helen found herself in a space that was both foreign and oddly familiar. The main room was large and well-appointed, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and furniture that looked handmade but sturdy. There were Comanche elements too, buffalo robes on the floor, painted shields and weapons mounted on the walls, a mixture of two worlds that somehow worked together. "There are 2 bedrooms, John said, gesturing toward doors off the main room. "You and Peter can take the larger one. I sleep in the barn most nights anyway, prefer it." He moved to the fireplace and began building a fire. "Thomas has been staying here while I was gone, but his wagon is outside. He has a circuit of settlements he visits, bringing supplies and teaching, but he stops here often." Thomas smiled. "This young man has become like a son to me, though he would never admit it. I stay because someone needs to make sure he remembers to eat properly and does not work himself into the ground." Over the next hour, as Thomas prepared a meal and John tended to Stormwalker, Helen began to relax for the first time in what felt like years. The house was warm, the food was plentiful, and Peter was actually laughing at something Thomas was saying. It felt surreal, this sudden transition from captive to guest, from being sold on an auction block to sitting at a table in a real house. During the meal, Thomas asked gentle questions about their ordeal, and Helen found herself telling the story of the raid, of James's death, of the long months with the Kiowa. John listened in silence, his face impassive, but she could see pain in his eyes. He understood, she realized. He had lived through his own version of this nightmare. When Peter began to yawn, Helen took him to the bedroom John had indicated. The room was simple but clean, with a large bed covered in quilts and a smaller cot pushed against the wall. There was a window that looked out toward the river, and Helen could hear the water flowing in the darkness. "Mama," Peter said as she helped him into the bed. "Is this our home now?" Helen paused, unsure how to answer. "I do not know, sweetheart. For now it is where we are staying, and Mr. John has been very kind to us." "I like him," Peter said, his eyes already drooping. "He is sad like us, but he is strong too. Like Papa was strong." Helen felt tears prick her eyes. "Yes, darling. He is strong like Papa." She kissed her son's forehead and stayed with him until his breathing deepened and he fell asleep. When she returned to the main room, she found John and Thomas sitting by the fire, speaking in low voices. They looked up as she approached, and Thomas stood. "I should retire to my wagon," he said. "Give you all some privacy. But I will return in the morning to help with chores." After Thomas left, Helen sat in the chair across from John, the fire crackling between them. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. I do not know how I will ever repay you." John shook his head. "There is no debt. I did what needed to be done." He stared into the flames. "Tomorrow, Thomas and I will show you how the ranch operates. You should know how things work here, how to care for yourself if something happens to me." "Nothing is going to happen to you," Helen said. Though she had no way of knowing if that was true. "Perhaps not," John agreed. "But the frontier is unpredictable. It is better to be prepared." He looked at her directly. "You and Peter are safe here, Helen. I give you my word. No one will take you. No one will harm you. This I promise." Helen believed him, and that belief itself was strange and precious. For 6 months she had trusted no one, had learned that safety was an illusion and kindness a trap. But something in John's eyes, in the quiet certainty of his voice, made her want to trust again. "I believe you," she said softly. They sat in silence for a while longer, two people bound together by tragedy and chance, by auctions and gold coins and the strange paths that life carved through the wilderness. Outside, the night deepened and stars emerged like diamonds scattered across black velvet. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called and was answered by another, their voices rising and falling in ancient conversation. And in that moment, sitting by the fire in a house built by a Comanche warrior who had learned to bridge two worlds, Helen felt something she had not felt since the morning James died. She felt like maybe, just maybe, she could begin to imagine a future that was not defined entirely by loss. The first week at John's ranch passed in a blur of discovery and adjustment. Helen woke each morning to the sound of roosters crowing and the distant whinny of horses, sounds that reminded her of her old life with James, but felt different here, less desperate somehow. The weight of survival had shifted from crushing to merely heavy, and she found herself breathing more easily with each passing day. John was true to his word about teaching them the workings of the ranch. He rose before dawn each day and had already completed half his morning chores by the time Helen emerged from the house. She would find him in the corrals working with the horses or repairing fence line, or checking the irrigation channels that brought water from the river to the small garden plot behind the house. He moved through his tasks with methodical precision, wasting no motion, and Helen quickly learned that he expected the same efficiency from anyone who worked alongside him. Peter took to ranch life with surprising enthusiasm. The boy who had been silent and withdrawn during their captivity now chatted constantly, asking John questions about everything from how to properly stack hay to why horses needed their hooves trimmed. John answered each question with patience, and more importantly, he gave Peter tasks that made the boy feel useful. Gathering eggs from the chicken coop, brushing down the gentler horses after John had exercised them, helping Thomas carry water from the well. Thomas Wright had indeed returned the morning after their arrival, and he had become a fixture around the ranch ever since. The old Quaker moved between John's property and several other settlements in the area, bringing supplies and news, teaching children to read, settling disputes with the wisdom of someone who had seen too much conflict to have any patience for unnecessary fighting. He treated John with the affection of a father, and he extended that same warmth to Helen and Peter, never prying but always available if they needed to talk. On the fourth day, Helen was in the garden pulling weeds when she heard the sound of approaching horses, multiple horses moving fast. Her heart seized in her chest, and she dropped the weeds, running toward the house where she had left Peter with Thomas. But before she could reach the door, John appeared from the barn, moving with surprising speed despite his limp. He carried no weapon, but his body language was alert, ready. "Inside," he said quietly but firmly. "Take Peter to the bedroom. Stay there until I come for you." Helen's throat tightened, but she nodded and did as he asked. She found Peter in the main room working on his letters with Thomas, and she scooped him up despite his protests. Thomas met her eyes and nodded, understanding immediately. "I will stand with John," he said, and there was steel beneath the gentle Quaker exterior. From the bedroom window, Helen could see 6 riders approaching. They were white men, rough-looking, the kind who drifted through the frontier taking what they wanted and leaving destruction in their wake. Her hands shook as she held Peter close, memories of the Kiowa raid flooding back, the helplessness, the terror. But John stood in the center of the yard, calm and still as stone, and Thomas stood beside him. The riders pulled up about 20 feet away, and the leader, a big man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, leaned forward in his saddle. "We heard there's an Injun living out here," the man said, his voice carrying clearly through the window. "Heard he's got himself some white captives. That don't sit right with us." John's expression did not change. "I am Silent Hunter of the Pennateca Comanche. This is my land, legally purchased and registered with the territorial government. The woman and child you refer to are under my protection, bought at legal auction in Fort Defiance. If you have concerns about the legality of these arrangements, you are welcome to take them up with Marshal Garrett." The scarred man spat tobacco juice onto the ground. "Don't much care about legal. Care about what's right. Ain't right for white women and children to be living with savages. I suggest thee reconsider thy position," Thomas said, his Quaker speech patterns becoming more pronounced. "John has done nothing wrong. The woman and child are here of their own free will, and they are treated with respect and kindness. Surely thee can see that violence serves no purpose here." One of the other riders laughed. "Old man thinks he can talk us out of doing our duty. We're here to liberate those captives, and if the Injun and his pet Quaker try to stop us, well, that'll be their mistake." Helen felt Peter trembling against her. She wanted to scream, to tell these men that John had saved them, that he had spent a fortune to keep them out of Cyrus Blackwood's hands. But she knew her voice would not carry, and even if it did, these men were not interested in truth. They were interested in violence, in the excuse to hurt someone different from themselves. John moved then, not toward violence, but toward one of the corrals. He opened the gate and whistled, a sharp, clear sound, and Stormwalker trotted out. The paint stallion was magnificent in the morning light, all power and grace, and John swung onto his back in one fluid motion, despite having no saddle or bridle. He guided the horse with his knees and his voice. Moving in a wide circle around the 6 riders, "I am called Silent Hunter," John said, his voice carrying a different quality now, something ancient and dangerous. "I have counted coup on 23 enemies in battle. I have tracked raiders across 3 territories. I carry letters of commendation from 3 army colonels. The woman and child in that house are worth more to me than my life. And if you think 6 drifters with borrowed courage can take them, you are welcome to try. But know this, if you draw weapons on my land, I will respond in kind, and the law will be on my side." The scarred man's hand moved toward his pistol, but one of his companions grabbed his arm. "Wait," the second man set his eyes on John. "I know you. You're the scout who tracked the Kiowa band that hit the Walker Ranch last spring. Saved those kids." John's expression softened slightly. "I remember. 2 boys and a girl. We found them 30 miles into the Llano Estacado." The second man looked at his companions. "This ain't right. This man ain't the enemy. He's helped more folks than most of us ever will." But the scarred man was not convinced. "Don't change the fact he's keeping white captives." They are not captives," John said flatly. "Come to the house. Ask the woman yourself. If she says she wants to leave, I will not stop her. But I think you will find that she prefers to stay." There was a long, tense moment when Helen thought violence was inevitable. She could see the calculation in the scarred man's eyes, the desire to prove himself warring with the dawning realization that John was not an easy target. Finally, the second rider spoke again. "We'll take you up on that. Let's hear what the woman has to say." John dismounted and gestured toward the house. "Thomas, would you ask Mrs. Parker to come out?" Thomas went to the house, and Helen met him at the door, her heart hammering. "You do not have to do this," Thomas said quietly. "John would not fault you for staying hidden." "No," Helen said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "I will not cower. These men need to understand." She walked out into the yard with Peter at her side, and 6 pairs of eyes fixed on her. She lifted her chin, refusing to be intimidated, refusing to be ashamed of surviving. "My name is Helen Parker," she said clearly. 6 months ago, Kiowa raiders attacked my homestead. They killed my husband James and took me and my son captive. We were recovered by the army and taken to Fort Defiance, where we were to be sold at auction to cover supposed debts." The scarred man interrupted. "And this Injun bought you?" "John saved us," Helen corrected sharply. "He outbid a rancher named Cyrus Blackwood, who had orchestrated the entire situation, who wanted to buy me for reasons that had nothing to do with charity. John spent $500 of his own money to keep us out of that man's hands, and he has asked nothing from us in return. We live in his house as free people. Peter and I are learning to work the ranch, learning to be useful, but we are not slaves, and we are not prisoners. We are here because this is the safest place we have found in a very long time." The second rider nodded slowly. Ma'am, are you saying you want to stay here? Yes, Helen said without hesitation. I'm saying exactly that. Peter stepped forward, his small voice carrying across the yard. Mr. John is teaching me about horses and tracking and how to read signs in the dirt. He is not mean like the Kiowa were, he is kind. Why are you being mean to him? The scarred man's face reddened, but he had no answer for a 7-year-old's logic. The second rider tipped his hat to Helen. Ma'am, we apologize for the intrusion. We heard stories and came to investigate, but it seems we were misinformed about the situation here. Stories from whom? John asked quietly. The second rider hesitated. Word came from the Broken Crown Ranch. Cyrus Blackwood has been telling anyone who will listen that you stole his property, that the auction was illegal, that you're holding captives against their will. John's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. Mr. Blackwood is angry that he was outbid. That is unfortunate, but it does not change the legality of the situation. If he has concerns, he knows where to find me. The riders left shortly after, the scarred man still mutinous but outvoted by his companions. Helen watched them disappear over the ridge, and then her legs gave out. She sat down hard in the dirt, shaking with delayed reaction, and John was beside her in an instant. Breathe, he said quietly. You are safe. They will not return. You cannot know that, Helen gasped out. Blackwood is spreading lies, turning people against you. This will not be the last time someone comes here with accusations. Perhaps not, John agreed. But each time they come, they will see the truth. Eventually, the lies will lose their power. He helped her stand. You did well, speaking for yourself, making them see you as a person rather than property. That took courage. Over the following days, Helen threw herself into learning everything she could about running the ranch. She was determined not to be a burden, not to be the helpless widow waiting to be rescued. John taught her how to care for the horses, how to recognize signs of illness or injury, how to mix feed and maintain equipment. She learned which plants were edible and which were poisonous, how to read weather signs in the sky, how to conserve water during dry spells. Thomas taught her other skills, how to preserve meat, how to make soap from lye and fat, how to patch clothing and repair boots. He also continued Peter's education, teaching the boy to read and write with patience and creativity. The old Quaker had a gift for making learning feel like play, and Peter blossomed under his attention. In the evenings, after the work was done, they would gather in the main room and talk. John spoke rarely about his past, but he was curious about Helen's life before the raid, about her childhood in Missouri, about how she and James had met. Helen found herself telling stories she had not thought about in years. Memories of her father's general store, of learning to keep accounts, of the day James had walked in, asking for supplies, and walked out with her promise to write to him. He was terrible at writing letters, Helen said one night, smiling at the memory. His spelling was atrocious, and his handwriting looked like a chicken had walked through ink. But he wrote to me every week for 6 months, until he had saved enough money to come back and ask my father for permission to court me properly. He sounds like a good man, John said quietly. He was, Helen agreed. He was not perfect. He was stubborn, and sometimes he pushed too hard, wanted too much too fast. But he loved Peter and me with everything he had, and he died trying to protect us, she paused. I think he would be grateful that we ended up here, that we found someone who would keep us safe when he could not. John looked uncomfortable with the praise, but he nodded. I hope so. Thomas stood and stretched. I must check on my wagon. The axle has been making concerning sounds, and I need to repair it before I continue my circuit. He looked at John and Helen. You two should rest as well. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. After Thomas left, Helen and John sat in comfortable silence for a while. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and Helen found herself studying John's profile. He was not handsome in the conventional sense, his features too angular, his scars too prominent. But there was something compelling about him, a quiet strength that drew her attention. May I ask you something? Helen said finally. Yes. When you bought us at the auction, did you have a plan? Did you know what you would do with two people who had nowhere else to go? John considered the question. I knew I would bring you here. I knew I would offer you safety and a place to live. Beyond that, no, I had no detailed plan. I do not think well that far ahead anymore. The frontier has taught me that plans are fragile things, easily shattered by circumstances beyond our control. Better to focus on the immediate need, the current moment. That is surprisingly philosophical for a man of action, Helen observed. Action and philosophy are not opposites, John said with a slight smile. Thomas has taught me that contemplation makes action more meaningful, more intentional. Before I met him, I simply reacted to the world. Now I try to consider why I do, what principles guide my choices. And what principles guided your choice to save us? Helen asked. John was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. The principle that every person deserves dignity, he said finally. That circumstances should not determine worth. You and Peter were being treated as commodities, as objects to be bought and sold. That was wrong. I had the power to stop it, so I did. That is the principle. Everything else is just details. Helen felt something shift in her chest, some wall she had built around her heart beginning to crack. This man who had been taught to see white settlers as enemies, who had lost everything to violence perpetrated by men who looked like her husband, had chosen to save her anyway. Not because of what she could offer him, not because he expected anything in return, but simply because it was the right thing to do. Thank you, she said softly. I know I have said it before, but I need to say it again. Thank you for seeing us as people worth saving. You have always been worth saving, John replied. You just needed someone to prove it to you. The next morning brought new challenges, as Thomas had predicted. Helen was working in the garden when she heard Peter shouting for her. She dropped her tools and ran, fear spiking through her, but when she reached the corral, she found Peter was not in danger. He was excited. John had brought out a young mare, barely more than a filly, and was saddling her with a smaller saddle than he usually used. Peter has been asking to learn to ride properly, John explained. This is Meadowlark. She is young but gentle, perfect for teaching. If you approve, I would like to begin his lessons today. Helen looked at her son's eager face, at the hope shining in his eyes, and she realized this was part of healing. Peter needed to learn new skills, needed to feel capable and strong, needed to rebuild his confidence after months of helplessness. Yes, she said, but please be careful with him. Always, John promised. She watched as John patiently taught Peter how to mount, how to hold the reins, how to sit properly in the saddle. The warrior's hands were gentle as he adjusted Peter's posture, his voice calm as he explained each concept. Meadowlark stood patient as stone, sensing the boy's inexperience and adjusting her own behavior to accommodate it. Peter's face was radiant with joy as John led the mare around the corral, walking beside them, one hand always ready to steady the boy if needed. Helen felt tears prick her eyes, but these were different tears, tears of gratitude rather than grief. Her son was smiling, really truly smiling, for the first time since James had died. Thomas appeared beside her, watching the scene with his own smile. John is good with children, he observed. He would have been a fine father. He still could be, Helen said without thinking, and then felt her face flush. I mean, he is young enough. He could marry again, have children of his own. Thomas gave her a knowing look but said nothing. They watched in silence as John continued the lesson. As Peter's confidence grew with each circuit of the corral, as something beautiful and new took root in the Texas soil, that evening, as they sat down to supper, Peter could talk of nothing but his riding lesson. He demonstrated with his hands how he had held the reins, how he had squeezed with his knees to make Meadowlark walk, how John had said he was a natural. John accepted the praise with quiet grace, occasionally correcting minor details, but mostly just letting the boy's enthusiasm wash over them. Zadusel. Later, after Peter had fallen asleep and Thomas had retired to his wagon, Helen found herself alone with John again. They had fallen into this pattern, these quiet evening conversations, and Helen had come to treasure them. There was something about the darkness, about the intimacy of firelight and low voices that made honest conversation easier. "Peter adores you," she said. "He has not bonded with anyone this way since his father died." "He is a good boy," John replied. "Smart, curious, brave. James raised him well in the time they had together." "John," Helen said carefully, "what happens when Thomas leaves on his circuit? It will just be the three of us here. Is that proper? Will people talk?" John's expression was unreadable. "People are already talking. 6 riders came here ready to accuse me of holding captives. Cyrus Blackwood is spreading poison about this place. What people think is already decided for many of them." He paused. "But if you are concerned about propriety, about your reputation, I can build a separate cabin. Give you and Peter your own space." "That is not what I meant," Helen said quickly. "I am not worried about my reputation. I am worried about yours. A Comanche man living with a white woman and her child. It gives people ammunition against you." "Let them have their ammunition," John said with a shrug. "I do not live my life according to their rules. I follow my own code, informed by Comanche tradition and Quaker principles and my own experience. If that makes me unacceptable to frontier society, so be it." Helen smiled despite herself. "You are a very unusual man, John Silent Hunter." "I've been told this before," he said, and there was humor in his voice. "Usually not as a compliment. I mean it as one," Helen said. She stood, suddenly nervous about where this conversation might lead. "I should check on Peter. Thank you again for today, for teaching him, for being patient with him." "It is my pleasure," John said simply, as Helen lay in bed that night, listening to Peter's soft breathing in the darkness. She thought about the strange turn her life had taken. 2 weeks ago, she had been standing on an auction block, facing a future too terrible to contemplate. Now she was living on a ranch with a Comanche warrior who quoted Quaker philosophy and trained horses and treated her son with a kindness that made her heart ache. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. She did not know what the future held. Cyrus Blackwood was still out there, still spreading his poison, still nursing his wounded pride. The frontier was still dangerous, still unpredictable, still capable of destroying everything she was beginning to build. But for the first time in 6 months, Helen felt like she had allies, like she was not facing the world alone. John had given her more than safety. He had given her hope. And that, she was beginning to realize, was the most valuable gift of all. 3 weeks into their new life, the first real test arrived not with gunfire, but with paperwork. Helen was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she saw a rider approaching from the east, moving at a steady trot rather than the aggressive gallop that usually preceded trouble. She called out to John, who was in the barn shoeing one of the horses, and he emerged, wiping his hands on a rag, his eyes immediately assessing the approaching figure. The rider was a Mexican man in his 50s, well-dressed in the manner of someone who worked in official capacity. He pulled his horse to a stop a respectful distance from the house and removed his hat. "I am looking for Mr. John Silent Hunter," he said in accented but clear English. "You found him," John replied, moving forward but keeping his body positioned between the rider and the house where Peter was inside with Thomas. "My name is Diego Alvarez. I'm a clerk for Judge Morrison in San Antonio. I have been sent to deliver these documents and to verify certain facts regarding a legal dispute." He reached into his saddlebag and produced a leather envelope. "May we speak somewhere more comfortable?" John gestured toward the house, and Diego dismounted, accepting the invitation with a slight bow. Helen followed them inside, her stomach churning with anxiety. Legal disputes meant courts, and courts meant Cyrus Blackwood had found a new way to attack them. Thomas made coffee, while Diego arranged his papers on the table. Peter watched from the corner where he had been practicing his letters, his young face creased with worry. Helen wanted to send him outside, but decided against it. The boy had lived through too much to be shielded from reality now. "The matter is straightforward," Diego began, accepting a cup from Thomas. "Mr. Cyrus Blackwood has filed a petition claiming that the auction in Fort Defiance was conducted improperly. He alleges that you, Mr. Silent Hunter, used intimidation and your status as a military scout to coerce Marshal Garrett into accepting your bid over his own. He is requesting that the transaction be voided and that Mrs. Parker and her son be returned to auction under proper supervision." Helen felt the room tilt. Returned to auction. The words hit her like a physical blow, dragging her back to that platform, to the eyes evaluating her worth, to the terror of being sold to the highest bidder. John's voice was ice. "That is a lie. I intimidated no one. I simply outbid Blackwood legally and in front of 60 witnesses. If he has a complaint, it is with his own lack of funds, not with any impropriety on my part." "I am not here to judge the merits of his claim," Diego said carefully. "I'm here to gather testimony and verify facts. The judge will make the final determination." He pulled out a notebook. "I need to ask you several questions, and I need to speak with Mrs. Parker separately to ensure her testimony is not influenced." "Absolutely not," John said flatly. "You will not separate her from this house or from my protection. If you need to speak with her, you will do so here, in front of witnesses." Diego raised his hands in a placating gesture. "I meant no offense. I simply wanted to ensure her answers are her own." "My answers are always my own," Helen said, finding her voice. "Ask whatever you need to ask, Mr. Alvarez. I have nothing to hide." For the next hour, Diego asked questions with the methodical precision of someone who had done this many times before. He asked about the auction, about the amounts bid, about whether Helen had been given any choice in who purchased her. He asked about her living conditions at the ranch, about whether she was free to leave, about whether John had made any demands or threats. He wrote everything down in careful script, occasionally asking for clarification. Helen answered each question honestly, her voice growing stronger as she realized that the truth was her best defense. Yes, John had outbid Blackwood. No, he had not intimidated anyone. Yes, she was living at his ranch. No, she was not a prisoner. Yes, she had been given a choice. And she had chosen to stay because John had shown her nothing but kindness and respect. When Diego finished with Helen, he turned to Thomas. "And you, sir, what is your relationship to this situation?" Thomas smiled gently. "I am a Quaker missionary and a friend to John. I have known him for 7 years, nursed him back to health when he was injured, watched him grow from an angry young warrior into a man of principle and purpose. I can testify that everything Mrs. Parker has said is true. John has treated her and her son with dignity and compassion. There is no coercion here, no impropriety, only a man trying to do what is right in a world that often punishes righteousness." Diego made more notes. "Mr. Blackwood has also alleged that you, Mr. Silent Hunter, have a history of violence, that you participated in raids against white settlements before becoming a scout. Is this true?" The room went silent. Helen held her breath, waiting to see how John would respond to this attack on his character. John met Diego's eyes without flinching. "When I was younger, yes, I rode with war parties. This was before the Quijada bands moved to the reservation, before the treaties were signed. I fought against settlers who were taking Comanche land, killing Comanche people. I do not apologize for defending my people during a time of war." He paused. "But that was 7 years ago. Since then I have worked for peace. I have scouted for the army to prevent conflicts, not cause them. I have helped return stolen livestock and rescued kidnapped children from both sides of the conflict. Judge Morrison has my service record. He can verify everything I am telling you." Diego nodded slowly. "I have already reviewed your service record. It is, I must say, quite impressive. The Army speaks highly of your tracking abilities and your role in preventing several potentially deadly confrontations." He closed his notebook. "I have what I need for now. The judge will review all testimony and make his ruling within the month. Until then, I must ask that Mrs. Parker and her son remain in the jurisdiction. No traveling beyond San Antonio without court approval. They are not going anywhere, John said. This is their home. After Diego left, the house felt smaller, the walls pressing in with the weight of uncertainty. Peter crawled into Helen's lap, something he had not done in weeks, reverting to the frightened child he had been. Thomas busied himself making lunch, but the usual comfortable silence had been replaced by tension thick enough to cut. John stood at the window, staring out at nothing, his jaw tight. Helen could see the frustration radiating off him in waves, the anger at being forced to defend himself, to justify his actions to people who had already decided he was guilty. "They will take us," Helen said quietly, voicing the fear that was choking her. "The judge will rule in Blackwood's favor because we are white and you are Comanche. And nothing we say will matter because the law was never meant to protect people like us from people like him." "No," John said, turning to face her. His eyes were fierce. "They will not take you. I will not allow it." "You may not have a choice," Helen said, hating how defeated she sounded. "If the judge rules against us, what can you do? Fight the law? Become an outlaw? Take us and run? All of those options end badly." Thomas set down the pot he had been stirring and came to sit at the table. "Perhaps it will not come to that." Diego seemed fair-minded. "He took down your testimony accurately. If Judge Morrison is a just man, he will see through Blackwood's lies." "And if he is not a just man?" Helen asked. Thomas had no answer for that. The days that followed were tense and strange. John threw himself into ranch work with almost manic energy, rising even earlier than usual and working until full dark. He was trying to outrun his thoughts, Helen realized. Trying to exhaust himself so thoroughly that he would not have to sit with the possibility of failure. Helen tried to maintain normalcy for Peter's sake, continuing his lessons, keeping to their routines. But the boy was not fooled. He became clingy again, reluctant to let her out of his sight, and at night he had nightmares that left him crying and confused. She would hold him until he calmed, singing the same lullabies her mother had sung to her, and she would feel the weight of everything pressing down on her chest until she could barely breathe. On the 5th day, after Diego's visit, they received an unexpected visitor. Helen was in the garden when she heard horses, multiple horses again, and her heart seized. But these were not rough frontier drifters. These were soldiers, 4 of them in U.S. Army uniforms, and they were led by a man whose bearing suggested command authority. John emerged from the barn as the soldiers approached. His face was carefully neutral, but Helen could see tension in his shoulders. The commanding officer dismounted and saluted, which surprised Helen. Why would an army officer salute a scout? "Mr. Silent Hunter," the officer said. "I am Captain William Hendricks from Fort Richardson. I apologize for the unannounced visit, but I have news regarding the legal matter you are currently facing." "What kind of news?" John asked warily. "The kind that requires us to speak privately," Hendricks said. He glanced at his men. "Sergeant, have the men water their horses. We will not be staying long." He turned back to John. "May we speak inside?" They gathered in the house, Thomas and Helen joining them because John refused to be alone with the army without witnesses. Hendricks removed his hat and accepted water, but declined to sit. He was a man used to delivering difficult news while standing. "Colonel Mackenzie asked me to ride out here personally," Hendricks began. "He has heard about Mr. Blackwood's petition and he is concerned. Not about your conduct, Silent Hunter, but about the precedent this case might set. If the courts allow a wealthy rancher to overturn a legal transaction simply because he lost a bidding war, it creates a dangerous situation for everyone who does business at frontier auctions." "I appreciate the Colonel's concern," John said carefully, "but I do not see how it helps us." Hendricks smiled slightly. "The Colonel has written a letter to Judge Morrison. A very detailed letter outlining your service record, your character, and his professional opinion that you have acted honorably in all your dealings with the army and with civilians. He has also included testimony from several officers and scouts who have worked with you, all speaking to your integrity." He produced an envelope from his coat. "This is a copy." The original was delivered to San Antonio 3 days ago. Helen felt hope flicker in her chest. Do you think it will make a difference? Judge Morrison served in the army before becoming a judge, Hendricks said. He respects military opinion, especially from officers of Colonel Mackenzie's stature. I cannot promise anything, but I believe this will weigh heavily in your favor. After the soldiers left, Helen allowed herself to breathe properly for the first time in days. It was not a guarantee, but it was something, a counterweight to Blackwood's accusations. John seemed lighter too, some of the terrible tension leaving his shoulders. The colonel did not have to do that, Helen observed. Why would he risk his reputation by involving himself in a civilian legal matter? Because he is a good man, John said simply. And because he understands that justice sometimes requires people in positions of power to use that power for those who have none. That night, for the first time since Diego's visit, they were able to sit by the fire and talk without the conversation being swallowed by anxiety. Peter was asleep, exhausted from a long day helping Thomas repair the chicken coop, and the adults allowed themselves the luxury of discussing something other than the looming court case. "Tell me about Bright Morning," Helen said suddenly, surprising herself. "You have told me how she died, but not how she lived. What was she like?" John was quiet for so long that Helen thought he would not answer. Then he began to speak, his voice soft with memory. She laughed at everything. Things that were not funny, she would find humor in them. She said life was too hard not to laugh when you could. She was small, barely reached my shoulder, but she was fierce. Once she fought off a rattlesnake with just a stick when it threatened her sister's baby. She did not hesitate, just acted. He smiled slightly. She wanted children. Many children. She said our lodge would be so full of noise and chaos that we would never know peace. She made it sound like the most wonderful thing imaginable. "She sounds remarkable," Helen said softly. "She was," John agreed, "and I dishonored her memory by spending years consumed with revenge." Thomas helped me see that. He said Bright Morning would want me to build things, not destroy them, to create life, not take it. That is why I bought this land, why I started raising horses, why I saved you and Peter. I'm trying to live the life she wanted us to have, even though she is not here to share it. Helen felt tears burning behind her eyes. "I think she would be proud of who you have become." "I hope so," John said. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Helen found herself studying John's profile again, the strong lines of his face, the way the firelight caught in his dark hair. She was becoming too comfortable here, she realized. Too accustomed to his presence, to the sound of his voice, to the safety she felt under his protection. It was dangerous to rely on anyone this much, dangerous to let down her guard. But she could not seem to help herself. "Helen," John said suddenly, "if the judge rules against us, if they try to take you back to auction, I want you to know that I will not simply accept it. I have plans, contingencies. You and Peter will not be separated. You will not be sold. This I promise you." "What kind of plans?" Helen asked, though part of her was afraid to know. "Thomas has contacts in Indian Territory and in Kansas. Communities that would welcome you, that would not ask questions. If necessary, we can disappear across the border into Mexico. I have money saved, enough to start over anywhere." His eyes were intense. "I will not lose you to Cyrus Blackwood's vindictiveness. I will not watch you be sold again. Whatever it costs, whatever I have to do, you will be free." Helen's breath caught. "John, if you do that, you will be an outlaw. The army will come after you. You will lose everything you have built here." "Things can be rebuilt," John said quietly. "You and Peter cannot. The choice is simple." Helen wanted to argue, wanted to tell him not to throw his life away for them, but the words stuck in her throat. Because part of her, the part that was tired of being afraid, tired of being helpless, was fiercely glad that someone was willing to fight for her. That someone saw her as worth the risk. "Thank you," she whispered, "for being willing to do that, for being willing to sacrifice so much." "It is not sacrifice," John said. "It is choice. And I choose you, both of you. Whatever comes." The firelight flickered across his face, and Helen saw in his eyes something that made her heart race. Not just determination or kindness, but something deeper, something neither of them had spoken aloud. Something that complicated everything and changed nothing and made the future both more frightening and more precious. Outside, a night bird called, its song piercing the darkness. Stormwalker whinnied softly in the corral, answered by meadowlark's gentle nicker. The ranch settled into its evening rhythms, unaware that the people who lived there were standing on the edge of a precipice, waiting to see if they would fall or fly. Helen stood, suddenly needing distance, needing space to think. "I should check on Peter," she said, though they both knew the boy was sleeping soundly. John nodded, but his eyes followed her as she crossed to the bedroom. And Helen felt the weight of that gaze, felt the promise and the danger in it, felt everything changing between them, whether she was ready for it or not. The storm was coming. She could feel it in her bones. The question was whether they would weather it together or be torn apart by forces neither of them could control. The summons arrived on a grey morning, 2 weeks after Captain Hendrix's visit. Helen was teaching Peter his arithmetic when she saw the dust cloud approaching, and her stomach dropped before she even recognized the rider. It was Diego Alvarez again, his face grave, as he dismounted and handed John an official-looking envelope, sealed with red wax. John broke the seal and read in silence, his expression unreadable. When he finally looked up, his eyes found Helen's across the yard. "Judge Morrison has scheduled a hearing, 5 days from now in San Antonio. We are both required to testify." Helen felt the world narrow to a pinpoint. 5 days. 5 days until everything they had built could be destroyed. Until she and Peter could be torn from this fragile safety and thrust back into the nightmare of being bought and sold like cattle. Diego cleared his throat apologetically. "The judge has also ordered that Mrs. Parker and the boy stay in town for the duration of the proceedings. He wants to ensure they are available for questioning and that there is no possibility of them being influenced by outside parties before testimony." "Absolutely not," John said, his voice like granite. "They stay here under my protection until the hearing." "I understand your concern," Diego said carefully, but the judge was quite clear. "If Mrs. Parker does not comply with this order, he will rule in Mr. Blackwood's favor by default." The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Separate them, isolate Helen and Peter, make them vulnerable. John's face showed he understood this too, and the fury in his eyes was barely contained. Thomas emerged from the barn. "Mrs. Parker and the boy could stay with me in town. I have lodgings with the Quaker community there. They would be safe and properly chaperoned." Diego considered this. "That might be acceptable. Let me send a message back to the judge proposing this arrangement." The compromise was reached after 2 tense days of waiting. Helen and Peter would stay with the Quaker community. John would be allowed to visit during daylight hours only, and always with a chaperone present. The journey to San Antonio took a full day of hard riding. John had arranged for a wagon so Helen and Peter could travel in relative comfort, with Thomas driving and John riding alongside on Stormwalker. They left before dawn, and Helen felt a superstitious dread that she might never see the ranch again. They reached San Antonio as the sun was setting. The Quaker meeting house stood on the eastern edge of town, and an elderly couple named Ezra and Patience Goodwin welcomed them with unquestioning hospitality. "Thee are safe here," Patience said, leading them to a small but clean room. "We will see that no harm comes to thee while thee are under our roof." John waited outside, and when Helen came to speak with him before he left to make his camp, she found him standing rigid with tension. "I do not like this," he said. "We are playing by Blackwood's rules, fighting on his territory." "We have no choice," Helen replied. "If we run now, we prove his accusations. We have to trust that the truth will be enough." "Truth is a luxury on the frontier," John said bitterly. Helen stepped closer. "Then we find a way to take his power away. We walk into that courtroom with our heads high, and we tell our story, and we make everyone see us as human beings, not property to be fought over." John looked at her, something shifting in his expression. "You have become fierce. When did that happen?" "When I realized I had something worth fighting for," Helen said. "The night before the hearing, Helen could not sleep. She found Patience Goodwin in the kitchen, also awake, preparing bread dough. They sat together in the quiet, and after a while, Helen found herself talking. Words spilling out about James's death, the captivity, John's rescue. "And what of thy feelings for John?" Patience asked gently. "There is more between you than simple gratitude, I think." Helen felt her face flush. "I do not know what there is between us. He saved us because of his own grief. I'm grateful, but gratitude is not the same as love. And even if it were, we are impossible. A white widow and a Comanche warrior. Love is not something that asks permission from society," Patience said quietly. "But these are questions for after the hearing. First thee must secure thy freedom." The courtroom was smaller than Helen expected, a simple room with rough-hewn benches. Judge Morrison sat behind a scarred wooden desk, his weathered face sharp as he surveyed the assembled crowd. Cyrus Blackwood sat at the front with his lawyer Patterson, who wore an expensive suit and a practiced smile. John sat on the opposite side with Samuel Chen, a young Chinese-American lawyer recommended by Captain Hendricks. Judge Morrison brought his gavel down. "This court is now in session. Mr. Patterson, you may present your opening argument." Patterson's voice was smooth and confident. "Your Honor, my client made a legitimate bid at a legal auction. However, he was intimidated by the defendant, a Comanche warrior with a known history of violence. Furthermore, Mr. Silent Hunter has no legitimate reason to purchase white captives except for purposes that are deeply questionable. We ask that the transaction be voided." Samuel Chen stood for the defense. "Your Honor, Mr. Silent Hunter has letters of commendation from multiple army officers. He is a respected scout who has saved lives on both sides of the frontier conflict. He purchased Mrs. Parker and her son to save them from Mr. Blackwood, who had demonstrated hostile intent. This is not impropriety. It is one man using his resources to prevent injustice." Blackwood took the stand first, claiming he had made the highest legitimate bid, that John had disrupted proceedings with threats, that a savage Indian had no business owning white women and children. Samuel Chen cross-examined, pointing out inconsistencies, but Blackwood was slippery, always redirecting blame. The prosecution called other witnesses who claimed intimidation, a minister who testified about moral wrongness, a banker who questioned John's money. Each testimony felt like a nail in their coffin. Helen watched hope slipping away. Then the defense called Marshal Garrett. The lawman's testimony was straightforward. Yes, John had arrived late and made a dramatic entrance. No, there had been no threats or intimidation. The bidding had been legal, the transaction completed according to proper procedures. Patterson tried to shake Garrett's testimony, but the marshal would not be moved. "I run clean auctions," Garrett said firmly. "If there had been any impropriety, I would have stopped it. There was none. Mr. Silent Hunter won fairly." Thomas Wright testified next, speaking about John's character, about the 7 years he had known him, about watching him transform from an angry warrior into a man of principle. "I have seen kindness where the world expects cruelty," Thomas said quietly. "If we punish this man for doing what is right, we lose something precious." Captain Hendricks testified about John's service record in detail, the lives saved, the conflicts prevented. "Mr. Silent Hunter has done more to promote peace than anyone I have known," Hendricks said. "To suggest he purchased Mrs. Parker for nefarious purposes is an insult to his proven character." Finally, Chen called Helen to testify. She walked to the stand on shaking legs, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. Chen led her through her story gently. She described the raid, James's death, the Kiowa captivity, the auction, Blackwood's cold calculation, and John's rescue. "Had Mr. Silent Hunter ever treated you or your son with anything less than complete respect?" Chen asked. "Never," Helen said firmly. "He has been kind and patient. He has given us safety when we had none, hope when we had lost it. He saved us, Mr. Chen, in every way that matters. Patterson stood for cross-examination. "Mrs. Parker, is it not true that you are entirely dependent on Mr. Silent Hunter for food, shelter, and protection?" "Yes," Helen admitted. "And is it not possible that your testimony is influenced by gratitude?" "By fear." Helen met Patterson's eyes directly. "My testimony is influenced by truth, sir. I'm grateful to John, but that gratitude is earned through his actions, not coerced through fear. I stay at his ranch because it is the best place for me and my son, and because I trust John in a way I trust very few people." "You trust a Comanche warrior," Patterson said skeptically. "That strains credulity." "I trust the man who spent $500 to save us," Helen said, her voice rising. "I trust the man who has worked alongside us every day, who has taught my son with patience. Judge me for that trust if you wish, but do not suggest it is misplaced when you have never seen how he lives." Patterson tried several more approaches, but Helen would not be shaken. The final witness was Peter. The boy walked to the stand with his head high, looking small in the formal courtroom. Judge Morrison leaned forward, his expression softening. "Young man, do you understand that you are here to tell the truth?" "Yes, sir," Peter said clearly. "My mama says truth is the most important thing." Chen kept his question simple. "Peter, are you happy living at Mr. Silent Hunter's ranch?" "Yes, sir. Mr. John is teaching me about horses and tracking. He is kind to me and my mama." "Do you feel safe there?" "Yes, sir. Much safer than with the Kiowa, much safer than at the auction." Peter's voice wavered. "That man," he pointed at Blackwood, "looked at my mama in a bad way. I was scared of him. But Mr. John made him go away, and now we are safe." Patterson did not cross-examine. Peter returned to sit beside Helen, and she held him close, tears streaming down her face. Judge Morrison called for a recess to consider the testimony. The wait was agonizing. Helen sat with Peter and Thomas in a small anteroom, unable to speak. John paced outside like a caged wolf. Finally, they were called back. Judge Morrison sat behind his desk, his face grave. "I have considered all testimony and evidence presented in this case," he began. "Mr. Blackwood's petition raises serious questions. However, after careful consideration, I find that these concerns are not supported by the facts." He looked directly at Blackwood. "The auction in Fort Defiance was conducted according to law. Mr. Silent Hunter's bid was legal and properly accepted. There is no evidence of coercion, only the wounded pride of a man who lost a bidding war." Helen felt her heart begin to race. "Furthermore," Morrison continued, "the testimony regarding Mr. Silent Hunter's character has been compelling and credible. I see no basis for voiding a legal transaction simply because the purchaser is not of the race Mr. Blackwood finds acceptable." He brought his gavel down. "The petition is denied. The transaction stands. Mrs. Parker and her son remain under Mr. Silent Hunter's legal guardianship, and I hereby issue an order prohibiting Mr. Blackwood from harassing them. This case is closed." The courtroom erupted. Helen sobbed, felt Peter throw his arms around her neck, heard Thomas's quiet prayer. Across the room, John's shoulders sagged with relief. Blackwood stormed out, his face purple with rage, shouting threats that no one paid attention to anymore. He had lost, publicly and completely. Outside the courthouse, in the fading afternoon light, Helen finally allowed herself to believe it was over. They were free, truly legally completely free. John approached, his eyes bright with emotion, and Helen did something she had not planned. She stepped forward and embraced him, holding him tight while Peter wrapped his arms around both their legs. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest. "Thank you for not giving up, for fighting for us." "Always," John said quietly. "For as long as you will have me always." And in that moment, standing in the dusty street of San Antonio with the courthouse behind them and the future stretching ahead, Helen understood that they had not just won a legal battle. They had won the right to choose their own path forward. Together, whatever that might mean, the journey back to the ranch felt different than the journey to San Antonio had been. The weight of dread had been replaced by something lighter, more fragile but infinitely more precious: hope. Real hope. not the desperate wishful thinking that had sustained Helen through the darkest days, but the solid certainty that they had won, that the law had sided with them, that Cyrus Blackwood's power had been broken. Peter fell asleep in the wagon halfway through the journey, his head resting on Helen's lap, his face peaceful in a way it had not been for months. Helen stroked his hair and watched the landscape roll past, the familiar hills and valleys that led back to what she now thought of as home. John rode alongside on Stormwalker, and occasionally their eyes would meet, conversations happening in silence that neither was quite ready to speak aloud. Thomas drove the wagon with the steady competence of someone who had traveled these roads many times before. He hummed quietly, old Quaker hymns that Helen did not recognize, but found comforting nonetheless. The old man had become family to her, she realized, not by blood or law, but by choice and shared experience, which might be stronger bonds anyway. They reached the ranch as the sun was setting, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. The house stood exactly as they had left it, solid and welcoming, and Helen felt something in her chest unclench. This place had waited for them. It would continue to wait, to shelter, to be the foundation upon which they could build whatever came next. John helped her down from the wagon while Thomas carried the still sleeping Peter inside. Helen stood in the yard for a moment, breathing in the smell of sage and dust and home. "I was afraid we would never see this place again," she said quietly. "So was I," John admitted. "But we are here. We are safe, and Blackwood can no longer touch us." "He will try to find other ways," Helen said, because she had learned that men like Blackwood did not simply accept defeat. "He will spread more lies, poison more minds against us." "Let him try," John said with a shrug. "We have the law on our side now. We have witnesses who testified to our character. And we have each other." He paused, as if realizing what he had said. "I mean, you and Peter have me. As protection." "As a guardian?" Helen smiled at his sudden awkwardness. "Yes, that is what you meant." The days that followed the trial fell into a new rhythm, similar to what had come before, but subtly different. There was a lightness to the work now, a sense that they were building towards something permanent rather than simply surviving day to day. John taught Peter more advanced riding techniques, and the boy's confidence grew with each lesson. Helen expanded the garden, planting vegetables that would not mature until next spring, an act of faith in a future that now seemed possible. Thomas stayed for 2 more weeks before resuming his circuit, but he promised to return regularly. "This place has become important to me," he told them on the morning of his departure. "You 3, you have shown me that redemption is not just possible but inevitable when people choose love over hate, courage over fear. I will carry that lesson with me." After Thomas left, it was just the 3 of them on the ranch, and Helen found herself hyper-aware of John's presence in a way she had not been before. She noticed how he always made sure there was firewood stacked by the door before she woke, how he would sit with Peter in the evenings and tell stories about the stars, teaching the boy Comanche names for constellations, how he moved through space with that peculiar combination of strength and gentleness that seemed uniquely his. One evening, about a month after their return from San Antonio, Helen found John in the corral working with a new horse, a young stallion he had acquired from a trader passing through. The horse was skittish, unused to human handling, and John was taking his time, letting the animal learn to trust him rather than forcing submission. Helen leaned against the fence and watched, fascinated by the patience he displayed. "You are good with frightened creatures," she observed. John glanced at her, a slight smile touching his lips. "I have experience being frightened. It teaches you how to recognize it in others." "Are you still frightened?" Helen asked. He considered the question, his hand resting on the horse's neck. "Yes, but of different things now. Before, I was afraid of my own anger, of what I might become if I let grief consume me. Now I'm afraid of losing what I have found. This place, this piece. You and Peter." Helen's breath caught. "John, I know," he said quickly. "I know it is complicated. I know we come from different worlds, that society will never fully accept us. I'm not asking for anything, Helen. I just need you to know that what I feel is not duty or obligation. It stopped being that a long time ago." Helen climbed over the fence, dropping into the corral beside him. The young stallion snorted nervously but did not bolt. "And what is it now?" she asked quietly. John turned to face her fully, his dark eyes intense. "I think you know. I want to hear you say it." "I love you," John said simply. "I love the way you refuse to be broken by what has broken so many others. I love how you fight for Peter even when you are terrified. I love the sound of your voice in the morning and the way you look at the stars like you are memorizing them. I love that you are here, that you chose to stay when you could have left." He paused. "And I understand if you do not feel the same. If what you feel is only gratitude or the comfort of safety. I will accept that, and I will not burden you with expectations. But I needed to say it once, to speak it aloud so you would know." Helen felt tears burning behind her eyes. "You think I stayed only for safety? I think you stayed because you are practical, and this is the best option for you and Peter," John said. "And that is fine." "That is enough. You are an idiot," Helen said. And then she kissed him. It was not the passionate embrace of storybooks. It was tentative and careful, two people who had been hurt, learning to trust again. But it was real. More real than anything Helen had felt in years, and when they finally pulled apart, they were both shaking. "I do not know how to do this," Helen whispered. "I do not know how to be with someone again, how to open my heart when I am still grieving James, still healing from everything that happened." "We learn together," John said. "We take our time. We make mistakes and forgive them. We build something new instead of trying to recreate what was lost." He cupped her face gently. "I'm not asking you to forget James or to pretend the past did not happen. I'm asking if you can imagine a future where we figure it out together, one day at a time." "Yes," Helen said. "I can imagine that." They told Peter the next morning over breakfast. The boy listened carefully as they explained that things were going to change, that John and Helen cared for each other in a way that was more than friendship, that they wanted to build a life together as a family if Peter was comfortable with that. Peter was quiet for a long moment, his young face serious. Then he looked at John. "Will you be my new papa?" John's voice was rough when he answered. "I will never replace your father, Peter. He was a good man who loved you very much. But I can be someone who is here for you, who teaches you and protects you and cares for you. If that is what you want," Peter nodded slowly. "Papa is gone. I know that. But you are here. And you make Mama smile again." He reached across the table and took John's hand. "I want you to stay." Helen watched this exchange through a blur of tears, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. They were becoming a family. This strange, cobbled-together unit of survivors who had found each other through tragedy and choice. The seasons turned. Autumn arrived with cooler temperatures and changing colors. Helen and John were married in a simple ceremony at the ranch, with Thomas officiating and Captain Hendricks serving as witness, along with a handful of people from the nearby settlements who had become friends. Peter stood between them during the vows, holding both their hands, and when Thomas pronounced them married, the boy cheered so loudly that even the horses in the corral could hear. The frontier being what it was, there were those who disapproved. Some neighbors stopped visiting. Certain merchants in town were less friendly than they had been. Helen heard whispers when she went to the general store, saw the sidelong glances and tight-lipped disapproval. But there were others who surprised her with their acceptance, who saw past the surface to the truth underneath. Mrs. Crane from the general store began inviting them to community gatherings. Captain Hendricks made a point of visiting the ranch regularly, his presence a tacit military endorsement that carried weight. Even Marshal Garrett stopped by once, ostensibly to check on a report of cattle rustlers, but really to make sure they were doing well. Winter came hard that year. Snow fell heavy in the hills, and the river froze at its edges. They spent long evenings by the fire, Peter working on his lessons, while Helen mended clothes, and John carved small figures from wood. He had discovered a talent for it. His hands that had once held weapons, now creating horses and birds and abstract shapes that Peter collected like treasures. One particularly cold night, when Peter had already gone to bed and the wind howled outside like a living thing, Helen and John sat close together near the fire. She had her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, and they watched the flames dance in comfortable silence. "Do you ever regret it?" Helen asked quietly. "Buying us at that auction, everything that came after, the trial, the prejudice, giving up the solitary life you had built." John was quiet for a moment. "I regret nothing except that it took so much pain to bring us to this moment. I regret that you had to suffer, that Peter had to lose his father, that my own grief was the price I paid to understand how to help you. But this, what we have now, this is worth every gold coin I spent and every hardship we faced." Helen tilted her head to look up at him. "Bright Morning would have liked you like this." "At peace, I think she would have liked you," John said. "She valued strength and kindness, and you have both in abundance." He kissed her forehead. "I used to think that loving again would be a betrayal of her memory. Thomas helped me understand that the opposite is true. The best way to honor those we have lost is to keep living, to keep choosing love and hope, even when the world gives us every reason to choose bitterness and despair." Spring arrived like a promise kept. The valley turned green, wildflowers exploded across the meadows, and the river ran high and fast with snowmelt. Helen's garden flourished, producing more vegetables than they could eat. John's horse breeding operation was gaining a reputation, with buyers coming from as far away as Fort Worth to purchase his well-trained animals. Peter had grown 2 inches and had become an accomplished rider, able to handle even the more spirited horses with confidence. On a warm April morning, Helen discovered she was pregnant. The realization came suddenly. A missed monthly course, and a persistent nausea that had nothing to do with anything she had eaten. She sat in the garden, one hand pressed to her still flat stomach, overwhelmed by a tangle of emotions. Joy that she and John were creating new life together. Fear that something would go wrong, that she would lose this baby the way John had lost his. Guilt that she was moving forward when James's grave was still fresh in her memory. She told John that evening, watching his face carefully for his reaction. He went very still, his expression unreadable, and for a moment she was afraid he would pull away, that the ghost of his lost child would rise between them. Then he dropped to his knees in front of where she sat, pressing his forehead against her stomach, his shoulders shaking. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for giving me this chance, for trusting me with this." Helen ran her fingers through his hair. "Are you afraid?" "Terrified," he admitted, "but also grateful beyond words." He looked up at her, tears tracking down his face. "We will do this together. We will get the best midwife. We will prepare everything, and when the time comes, I will be here. I will not fail you the way I failed Bright Morning." "You did not fail her," Helen said firmly. "The storm failed her. The distance failed her. The midwife failed her. But you did everything you could. And this time will be different. I'm strong, the baby is strong, and we have time to prepare," they told Peter a week later. The boy's reaction was pure delight. "I am going to be a big brother," he announced to anyone who would listen. "I am going to teach the baby everything Mr. John taught me." Thomas returned in late spring and blessed the news with tears in his eyes. "New life is always a miracle," he said, "but new life born from such tremendous healing, that is a double blessing." The pregnancy progressed without complication. Helen grew round and glowing, her energy sometimes flagging, but her spirits high. John was attentive to the point of being overprotective, constantly worrying about whether she was lifting too much or working too hard. She tolerated his hovering with good humor, understanding that it came from love and fear in equal measure. In October, as the leaves were turning gold again, and the air held the first hint of winter, Helen went into labor. John rode like the wind to fetch the midwife, a capable woman named Sarah Two Rivers, who had delivered babies for both white settlers and Comanche families. Sarah arrived calm and efficient, taking over Helen's bedroom with practiced authority. The labor was long but not complicated. Peter waited in the main room with Thomas, who distracted the anxious boy with stories and games. John refused to leave Helen's side, holding her hand through each contraction, wiping sweat from her forehead, whispering encouragement when the pain grew intense. And then, as the sun was setting and painting the room in shades of amber and rose, their daughter was born. She came into the world screaming with impressive lung power, her tiny face red and furious at the indignity of birth. Sarah placed her in Helen's arms, and the baby's cries quieted as she felt her mother's heartbeat. John stared at his daughter with an expression of such profound wonder that Helen felt fresh tears spring to her eyes. "She is perfect," he whispered. "She is absolutely perfect." They named her Grace Morning Parker Silent Hunter, honoring both the hope she represented and the woman whose memory had guided John to this moment. Peter was allowed in to meet his new sister, and he held her with exquisite care, his young face solemn with the weight of his new responsibility. That night, after Peter had gone to bed and Sarah had left with promises to return the next day, John and Helen sat together with Grace sleeping between them. The baby was wrapped in a soft blanket, her tiny fists curled near her face, her breathing steady and strong. "I am not afraid anymore," John said quietly. "For the first time in 7 years, I'm not afraid of the future. I'm not waiting for tragedy to strike, for everything to be taken away. I'm just here in this moment with my family, and it is enough." Helen reached for his hand. "It is more than enough. It is everything, and the years that followed were not without challenges. The frontier remained harsh and unpredictable. Droughts came and went, cattle sometimes fell sick, neighbors occasionally proved difficult. But they weathered each storm together, the 4 of them, and then 5, when Grace was joined by a brother they named James Thomas, honoring both Helen's first husband and the Quaker missionary who had made so much possible. Peter grew into a young man who could ride like a Comanche and think like a scholar, equally comfortable on horseback or with a book. Grace inherited her father's quiet intensity and her mother's fierce determination. Little James was still too young to show his nature, but he laughed easily and charmed everyone who met him. The ranch prospered. John's reputation as a horse trainer spread across Texas, and people came from hundreds of miles away to purchase his animals. Helen ran the business side with the same competence she had once applied to her father's general store. Together they built something that would last, something that could be passed down to their children and their children's children. Cyrus Blackwood died 5 years after the trial, bitter and alone. His fortune diminished by poor investments and his reputation destroyed by his own vindictiveness. Helen felt no joy at his passing, only a quiet relief that the threat he had represented was finally permanently ended. Thomas Wright continued his circuit for many more years before age finally forced him to settle permanently at the ranch. He built a small cabin near the main house and spent his final years teaching the children and tending a garden that produced the most remarkable vegetables anyone had ever seen. When he died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 83, they buried him on a hill overlooking the valley, and his grave became a place where the family would go to sit and remember and be grateful. On a warm evening in late summer, 10 years after that auction in Fort Defiance, Helen and John sat on the porch, watching the sun set over their land. The children were playing by the river, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Grace was teaching her younger brother how to skip stones while Peter supervised, young and responsible and so much like his father that sometimes Helen's breath caught. "Do you remember when you first brought us here?" Helen asked, her hand finding John's. "How broken we both were. How impossible this all seemed. I remember thinking I was saving you," John said with a slight smile. "I did not realize you would save me right back." "We saved each other," Helen corrected. "That is how family works." John pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "Yes, that is how family works." The sun sank lower, painting the sky in colors that had no names, and the ranch settled into its evening rhythms. Horses whinnied softly in the corrals. The river sang its eternal song. The children's laughter rose and fell like music. And two people who had been lost, who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, sat together and watched their life unfold exactly as it was meant to. Not perfect, because perfection was a fantasy, but real and earned and precious beyond measure. Home at last in every way that mattered. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.